Sleep is a luxury the guilty cannot afford. For Destin Russo, the night wasn't for resting. It was a blank canvas for every mistake, every betrayal, and every drop of blood he'd spilled to replay on a vicious, unending loop. Meds didn't work. Whiskey only made the shadows move. He was a man drowning in the dark, seconds away from a total mental collapse, until he heard her voice, a soft, steady cadence cutting through the silence. His only piece, the clock on the wall, didn't tick. Destin had dismantled it 3 days ago, tearing the battery from its casing and tossing it into the wastebasket. But he could still hear it, the phantom rhythm of seconds slipping away. It had been 94 hours since he last slept. He sat at the edge of his bed staring at the floorboards. His eyes burned, feeling as though someone had rubbed crushed glass under his eyelids. The muscles in his jaw were locked tight, a permanent state of tension that radiated down his neck and settled heavily in his shoulders. To the rest of the city, Destin Russo was untouchable. He was the architect of an empire built on extortion, smuggling, and precisely calculated violence. He was a man who moved pieces on a board with cold mechanical efficiency, but in the dead of night, in the sprawling, empty confines of his estate, he was just a man unraveling. Insomnia wasn't new to him. It was an occupational hazard, but this stretch was different. The exhaustion was a physical weight pressing down on his chest. Every time he closed his eyes, his brain flooded with noise. Gunfire, the wet thud of a body hitting the pavement, the frantic gasping apologies of men who knew they were taking their last breath. His mind refused to power down. It was standing guard, hyper-vigilant, convinced that the moment he slipped into unconsciousness, a knife would find his throat. Destin stood up. His legs felt like lead. He walked to the adjoining bathroom and turned on the cold tap, letting the water run over his wrists. He splashed his face, gripping the edges of the marble sink. The face staring back at him in the mirror was sallow. Dark, bruised-looking circles carved deep half-moons under his eyes. "Get it together," he muttered to the glass. His voice sounded hollow, rough like sandpaper. He left the bedroom and began to walk. The estate was massive, a fortress of steel and stone masquerading as a piece of architectural art. It was entirely silent save for the muffled footsteps of the perimeter guards outside. Destin walked the halls like a ghost haunting his own purgatory. He passed the study, the formal dining room, the heavy oak doors that led to the basement where the real business was handled. His wandering eventually brought him to the East Wing, the guest quarters, though they weren't exactly for guests. Crystal Martin was currently occupying the last room on the right. Destin rubbed his temple, trying to ease the dull throbbing behind his right eye. Crystal wasn't supposed to be here. She was a complication, a loose end left over from her father's profound stupidity. Arthur Martin had been a bookkeeper for the Russo family, a quiet, unassuming man who had quietly and unassuming skimmed $300,000 over 5 years. When Victor, Destin's right hand and the syndicate's chief enforcer, found out Arthur's life expectancy had dropped to 0, Arthur had blown his brains out before Victor could get to him, leaving the debt unpaid and a daughter totally unaware of her father's secret life. Destin hadn't wanted to kill the girl. It was messy. It lacked purpose. Instead, he absorbed her. He took her from her cramped apartment, brought her to the estate, and put her to work. She was an archivist by trade, someone who restored old texts and organized municipal records. Now she spent her days in his windowless basement auditing 10 years of the family's legitimate and illegitimate ledgers to find out exactly where her father's stolen money went. She was a prisoner working off a blood debt she hadn't accrued. He expected her to cry. He expected hysteria. Instead, Crystal had arrived with a single suitcase, pale and terrified but silent. She worked 10-hour shifts. She ate the meals brought to her. She didn't speak unless spoken to. Destin walked past her door, intending to head to the kitchen for another cup of useless, bitter coffee. But he stopped. A sound was slipping through the crack beneath her door. A voice. He stepped closer, his hand instinctively resting on the cold steel of the holster strapped to his ribs. He pressed his shoulder against the doorframe, holding his breath to listen. She was talking. No, she was reading. Her voice was low, pitched just above a whisper, but the silence of the hallway magnified it. It wasn't the frantic, panicked tone of someone making an illicit phone call. It was rhythmic, paced. The dust hung in the air like suspended gold, catching the afternoon light. It was quiet in the valley, the kind of quiet that sinks into the bone. The river moved sluggishly, uncaring of the war raging 50 miles to the north. Destin frowned. He recognized the prose. It was an old Western novel, something gritty and slow-moving. He should have kept walking. He had no business eavesdropping on a captive's midnight coping mechanism, But he didn't move. He closed his eyes. Her voice lacked the sharp, abrasive edge of the people he dealt with daily. It wasn't trying to sell him something. It wasn't lying to him. It wasn't begging for its life. It was just a sound, steady, grounded. The cadence of her sentences rose and fell like a tide. It was incredibly mundane, and for the first time in 94 hours, the noise in Destin's head paused. He leaned his back against the wall next to her door. The cold plaster felt good against his heated skin. He let his head tip back. She kept reading. She stumbled over a word, paused, and reread the sentence with a soft, self-deprecating sigh. The humanity in it was startling. Destin felt his breathing slow down. The tight, agonizing knot in his chest loosened by a fraction of an inch. He listened to her describe a fictional river. He listened to her turn a page, the dry rustle of paper loud in the stillness. His eyelids fluttered. They felt so heavy. Just for a minute, he told himself, he would just rest his eyes for a single minute. When Destin woke up, the hallway was bathed in the gray, weak light of dawn. He jerked upright, his heart slamming against his ribs. He patted his chest, checking for his weapon, his eyes darting wildly down the empty corridor. Disorientation hit him like a physical blow. He had fallen asleep sitting on the floor in the hallway. He looked at his watch. 6:15 a.m. He had slept for 4 hours. A wave of profound humiliation washed over him, quickly followed by a staggering realization. 4 hours of dreamless, uninterrupted sleep. His mind felt sharper. The agonizing burn in his eyes had dulled into a manageable ache. He looked at Crystal's closed door. The reading had stopped long ago. Destin stood up, his joints protesting the hard floor. He smoothed the front of his shirt, a sudden fierce possessiveness taking root in his chest. He needed to sleep again tonight, and he knew exactly how he was going to do it. Victor Moretti dropped a heavy manila folder onto Destin's desk. It hit the mahogany with a solid smack. "The shipments at the docks are clear," Victor said, pulling out a chair and sitting down. He was a large man, built like a brick wall with a scar slicing through his left eyebrow that gave him a permanent scowl. Customs took their cut. "We're greenlit to move the cargo tonight." Destin nodded, flipping the folder open. He scanned the manifest, his eyes tracked the lines of text smoothly. No blurring, no microsleeps. Victor leaned forward, narrowing his eyes. "You look different." "I took a shower, Victor," Destin said flatly, turning a page. "No, I mean you don't look like you're about to drop dead. You sleep?" "A bit," Victor snorted. "Good, because the Petrovs are pushing the border on the south side again. We need you sharp. If you're running on fumes, they'll smell the blood in the water." "I'll handle the Petrovs," Destin said, closing the folder. "Leave me the rest of the paperwork. I have a meeting." "With who?" "Internal audit." Victor looked confused, but didn't press. He stood up, adjusting his suit jacket. "Call me if you need to crack heads." When the door clicked shut, Destin leaned back in his chair. It was 5 o'clock in the afternoon. The dread that usually accompanied the approaching evening was absent. He didn't feel the creeping panic of the setting sun. He felt anticipatory. He buzzed the intercom on his desk. "Bring Crystal Martin to my office." 10 minutes later, the heavy oak doors opened. Crystal stood in the threshold. She was wearing a simple gray sweater and dark jeans. Her hair was pulled back into a messy knot, and there were ink stains on the sides of her fingers. She looked exhausted, her posture guarded. She didn't look at him directly, keeping her gaze fixed on the edge of his desk. "You wanted to see me, Mr. Russo." "Sit," Destin said, gesturing to the chair Victor had just vacated. She walked over stiffly and sat on the very edge of the leather cushion. She looked like a bird ready to take flight at the first sudden movement. "Is there an issue with the ledgers?" she asked, her voice tight. "I found the discrepancy in the 2021 accounts. My father routed the funds through a shell company in Delaware. I have the routing numbers, but I need access to the offshore server to track where it went next." "I don't care about the ledgers," Destin said. Crystal finally looked up, blinking in surprise. Her eyes were a very ordinary shade of brown, but they held a sharp, wary intelligence. "You don't? I mean, I do." "Keep working on them," Destin corrected smoothly. He steepled his fingers, suddenly realizing how absurd his next request was going to sound. He was Destin Russo. He didn't ask for favors. He gave orders. But ordering a woman to read him bedtime stories crossed the line from terrifying Mafia boss to deeply unhinged. He opted for blunt force. "You read out loud last night," he said. Crystal froze. The color drained from her face. "I what?" "Around 2 o'clock in the morning, you were reading a book out loud in your room." Her hands curled into fists in her lap. "I'm sorry, I have anxiety. When I can't sleep, reading out loud grounds me. I didn't realize the sound carried. I won't do it again." "No," Destin said sharply. "You will." Crystal stared at him, utterly lost. "I will what?" You will read out loud again tonight, but not in your room. Destin leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk. He kept his expression entirely neutral, masking the desperation clawing at his throat. I suffer from insomnia, severe insomnia. Last night I heard your voice. It distracted me. I fell asleep. Crystal's mouth parted slightly. She looked at him as if he had just spoken in tongues. You fell asleep listening to me read a Louis L'Amour novel? I don't care what the book was, Destin said, dismissing the detail. I care about the result. Tonight at midnight you will come to my private study on the 3rd floor. You will bring a book. You will read to me until I fall asleep. Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Crystal looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the lingering shadows under his eyes, the tight pull of his jaw. The realization that the monster who held her life in his hands was asking her for a lullaby was clearly short-circuiting her brain. Is this a joke? She asked quietly. I don't make jokes, Miss Martin, and if I say no? Destin's eyes went cold. The brief flash of vulnerability vanished, replaced by the ruthless pragmatism that kept him alive. You owe me $300,000. You are currently paying it off at a rate of $500 a week through clerical labor. You will be here for 12 years. If you read to me and I sleep, I will deduct an extra $1,000 from your debt for every night. Crystal's breath hitched. $1,000 a night. It was an impossible amount of money. It was a lifeline. She looked down at her ink-stained fingers, her mind working furiously. She was terrified of him. Everyone was terrified of Destin Russo. But this wasn't a demand for violence or something unspeakable. It was bizarrely, pathetically human. What kind of book? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Destin felt a profound wave of relief wash over him, though his face betrayed nothing, anything, so long as it isn't quiet. Midnight, she confirmed. Don't be late. The 3rd floor study was a room designed for intimidation. The walls were lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes that had never been read. The furniture was heavy, dark mahogany and tufted oxblood leather. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, though it hadn't been lit in years. Heavy velvet curtains blocked out the moonlight, leaving the room illuminated only by a single brass reading lamp on a side table. At exactly midnight, there was a soft knock on the door. Come in, Destin said. He was sitting in the large leather armchair by the unlit fireplace, wearing dark slacks and a loose black Henley. He had discarded his holster, a rare concession to comfort, though a loaded 6-hour sat on the side table next to the lamp, well within arm's reach. Crystal pushed the door open and stepped inside. She looked small in the cavernous room. She was clutching a thick, worn paperback to her chest like a shield. She looked around, her eyes landing on the gun first, then on him. Sit, Destin said, pointing to a smaller wingback chair positioned across from him near the light. Crystal crossed the room silently and sat down. She kept her knees pressed tightly together, opening the book in her lap. The tension in the air was suffocating. She was sharing a secluded room with the head of the city's most violent crime syndicate. The power dynamic was so wildly unbalanced, it made the air feel thin. Destin reached over and clicked off the overhead chandelier with a remote, leaving only the pool of yellow light from the reading lamp spilling over Crystal. He remained mostly in the shadows. Begin. Crystal cleared her throat. She looked down at the page. Her hands were shaking slightly. Chapter 1, she began. Her voice wavered. It was thin, tight with fear. The ocean was a vast iron-gray expanse, churning angrily under a bruised sky. Stop, Destin commanded. Crystal flinched, snapping her mouth shut. She looked up, panicked. I'm sorry. You're terrified, Destin said, his voice flat. Your heart rate is through the roof. I can hear your breathing catching. It's grating. Crystal's jaw tightened. A spark of genuine anger broke through her fear. I'm sitting in a dark room with a man who could snap my neck and bury me in the foundation. Forgive me if I'm not entirely relaxed. Destin stared at her from the shadows. It was the first time she had shown any real fire. He liked it. It meant she wasn't broken, just bruised. I am not going to hurt you, Crystal, he said, the use of her first name intentional. If I wanted to hurt you, you wouldn't be sitting in a velvet chair holding a book about boats. You are here to do a job. Treat it like one. Take a breath. Lower your register. Just read. Crystal held his gaze for a long moment. She swallowed hard, forced her shoulders to drop an inch, and looked back at the page. She took a deep, shuddering breath. When she started again, it was better. The tremor was gone. The ocean was a vast, iron-gray expanse, churning angrily under a bruised sky. Captain Miller stood at the helm, the salt spray freezing against his beard. Destin leaned his head back against the leather chair and closed his eyes. For the first 10 minutes, his mind fought it. The paranoia screamed at him that he was vulnerable. There was a woman in the room. A woman whose father had died because of his organization. What if she grabbed the gun? What if she had a knife? But as the minutes ticked by, Crystal's voice acted as an anchor. She didn't read with excessive emotion or dramatic flair. She read like someone who genuinely loved the words, giving them space to breathe. She paused at the natural breaks. She lowered her tone during the dialogue. The rhythmic cadence of her voice began to overwrite the violent noise in his head. He focused entirely on the sound. He imagined the iron-gray ocean. He imagined the cold wind. He stopped thinking about the paychecks, the missing money, the shipment at the docks. In the wingback chair, Crystal watched him. She read automatically, her eyes tracking the words while her mind processed the surreal scene in front of her. Destin Russo, the terror of the underworld, was slumped in an armchair completely still. The harsh, terrifying lines of his face had softened. The perpetual scowl was gone. In the dim light, he didn't look like a monster. He looked like a profoundly exhausted man. She kept reading. She reached the end of the chapter and turned the page. The rustle of the paper was loud, but he didn't stir. His breathing deepened, becoming slow and even. Crystal stopped reading mid-sentence. Silence rushed back into the room. Destin didn't move. His chest rose and fell in a steady, heavy rhythm. He was asleep, completely, deeply asleep. Clear's throat, Crystal sat frozen for a long time. She looked at the gun on the table. It was 2 feet away from his hand. She could reach it. She could take it, shoot him, and walk out. But the thought was fleeting, dismissed as quickly as it came. She wasn't a killer. And more than that, looking at him now, stripped of his power and posturing, she realized he was entirely at her mercy. She, the captive, the collateral damage, held the key to the one thing he couldn't take by force: peace. Crystal quietly closed the book. She didn't leave the room. He hadn't dismissed her, and she wasn't about to risk waking him up by opening the heavy oak doors. Instead, she curled her legs up under her in the chair, wrapped her sweater tightly around her shoulders, and watched the chest of the Mafia boss rise and fall until the sun began to bleed through the edges of the curtains. A contract had been struck, $1,000 a night. But Crystal had a feeling the real currency exchanging hands in this dark room was going to be much more complicated than cash. 14 days, 40 nights, $14,000 erased from a ledger in the windowless basement. The routine cemented itself into the foundation of the estate. At 11:55 p.m., Crystal climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor. At midnight, she sat in the wingback chair. She opened a book and she spoke until the man in the shadows stopped fighting his own mind. The change in Destin Russo was undeniable. The bruised, hollow look beneath his eyes faded, replaced by the sharp, terrifying focus that had built his empire in the first place. He moved with precision instead of dragged exhaustion. Down at the docks and in the back rooms of the city's underground casinos, men spoke of the boss's sudden resurgence with a mixture of reverence and fear. The erratic, hair-trigger temper born of sleep deprivation was gone. In its place was a cold, calculating calm that was infinitely more dangerous. Victor Moretti noticed. Everyone noticed. But no one asked questions. For Crystal, the basement daylight hours remained a tedious blur of numbers and shell corporations. She traced her dead father's desperate, stupid theft across bank accounts in the Cayman Islands and Cyprus. But the nights were different. The nights belonged to the study. It was a Tuesday when the rigid edges of their arrangement finally cracked. Crystal arrived at the study feeling terrible. A dull ache throbbed behind her temples, and her throat felt like it was coated in crushed glass. The damp, recycled air of the basement had finally caught up with her. She sat in her usual chair. Destin was already there, leaning back in the oxblood leather, eyes closed, waiting. Chapter 4. Crystal rasped. Her voice sounded terrible, thick and gravelly. She cleared her throat, wincing, and tried again. The expedition pushed further into the Amazon, the canopy blocking out the sun completely. She made it through 2 paragraphs before a coughing fit seized her. It wasn't a delicate, polite cough. It was a harsh, chest-rattling spasm that forced her to double over. The heavy hardback book sliding from her lap to hit the floor with a loud thud. She pressed her hand to her mouth, tears of physical strain pricking her eyes. When the coughing finally subsided, she sat up gasping for air, bracing herself for his anger. She had broken the silence. She had failed the one task keeping her out of a shallow grave. Destin was no longer sitting in his chair. He was standing beside the small mahogany bar cart in the corner of the room. He wasn't looking at her. He picked up a heavy crystal tumbler, grabbed a bottle of distilled water, and poured. He added no ice. Crystal watched him, her breathing ragged. He walked over to her, his footsteps entirely silent on the thick Persian rug. She stopped in front of her chair and held out the glass. "Drink," he said. His voice wasn't an order, though it carried the weight of one. It was flat, unreadable. Crystal took the glass. Her fingers brushed against his knuckles. His skin was warm, a stark contrast to the cold crystal. She drank the water greedily, the cool liquid soothing the raw burn in her throat. Destin reached down and picked up the fallen book. He looked at the cover, a dense history of South American exploration. He didn't hand it back to her. "You're sick," he stated. "It's just a cold," Crystal whispered, her voice still rough. "The air in the archives is dry. I can keep reading. I just need a minute. You sound like you've been swallowing gravel." Destin walked back to his chair and sat down, tossing the heavy book onto the side table next to his gun. "Go back to your room." Panic flared in Crystal's chest, the math instantly calculated in her head. One night missed, $1,000 lost, a day added to her sentence. "No, please, I can do it. I just need to read slower. I can lower the register." Crystal. The sound of her name on his lips stopped her frantic rambling. He rarely used it. Usually she was just a presence in the room, a voice box he commanded. "I'm not docking your pay," Destin said, reading the terror in her eyes with unsettling accuracy. "The 1,000 comes off the ledger. Go to sleep." Crystal stared at him. The dim brass light threw sharp shadows across his cheekbones. He was giving her a night off. He was forfeiting the sleep he so desperately needed because he had a sore throat. It made absolutely no sense. He was a man who ordered executions over delayed shipments. "What will you do?" she asked, the question slipping out before her self-preservation instincts could stop it. Destin's gaze darkened. He looked away, staring at the unlit fireplace. "I will manage. You'll sit in the dark and stare at the wall," Crystal said. It wasn't an accusation, it was a fact. She had seen the ghosts behind his eyes. They were waiting for her to leave so they could tear him apart again. "Go to bed, Ms. Martin," he warned, his tone dropping a lethal octave. The door slammed shut on the brief moment of humanity. The boss was back. Crystal stood up. She set the empty crystal glass on the table next to the gun. She looked at the weapon, then at the man. She didn't leave. Instead, she reached into the pocket of her cardigan and pulled out a small battered paperback she had found in the estate's sprawling library earlier that week. She sat back down. Destin's jaw tightened. "I gave you an order." "I know," Crystal said softly. She opened the paperback. It was a collection of poetry, short, rhythmic, requiring very little breath. "But you're paying me $1,000 an hour. I prefer to earn my keep." She didn't wait for him to argue. She began to read. Her voice was a raspy whisper, barely carrying across the space between them, but the rhythm was flawless. Destin stared at her for a long minute, his muscles coiled, ready to drag her out of the room himself. But she didn't look up. She just kept reading the verses. Slowly the tension bled out of his shoulders. He leaned back, he closed his eyes. She read for 20 minutes until he fell asleep. She sat in the quiet watching his chest rise and fall, realizing with a terrifying clarity that she wasn't just surviving this man anymore. She was protecting him. The outside world eventually bled in. It always did. It was 1:30 a.m. on a Friday. Crystal was sitting in the dark study, the book open in her lap, but she wasn't reading, she was waiting. Destin hadn't shown up. The estate had been vibrating with a chaotic, suppressed energy all evening. Black SUVs had roared down the driveway just past sunset. She had heard Victor shouting in the lower halls, a sound so violent it made her stomach turn. The Petrovs. She had heard the guards whispering the name outside her door. The rival syndicate from the South End had made a move on a Russo warehouse. Crystal should have stayed in her room. She should have locked her door and hidden under the blankets like a sensible hostage. Instead, at midnight, she had walked up to the 3rd floor. At 1:45 a.m., the heavy oak doors crashed open. Destin walked in. Crystal gasped, dropping the book. He looked like a man who had walked through a slaughterhouse. His dark suit jacket was gone, his white dress shirt torn at the shoulder, and there was blood. It was splashed across his chest, smeared on his neck and coating his hands. It wasn't his. He was moving with too much predatory energy to be fatally wounded. He didn't see her at first. He walked straight to the bar, grabbed a bottle of scotch by the neck and poured a massive measure into a glass, splashing amber liquid onto the mahogany. His hands were shaking, not from fear, from adrenaline, the raw chemical high of violence. He downed the glass in one swallow, slammed it down, and finally turned toward the center of the room. He stopped dead when he saw Crystal in the wingback chair. The beast was fully awake, his eyes. The pupils were blown wide, black and hollow. The civilized veneer he wore during their midnight sessions was completely stripped away. This was the man who had ordered her father's death. This was the monster of the city. "Get out!" Destin snarled. His voice was a guttural rasp, unrecognizable. Crystal pressed her back against the chair, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The metallic copper smell of blood reached her from across the room. It made her gorge rise. She wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at her to flee. "I said get out," he roared, taking a step toward her. He looked down at his hands, seeing the red smeared across his skin, and a flash of profound self-loathing crossed his face before hardening back into rage. "You shouldn't be here. Look at me. Get out before I forget why I keep you around." He was losing his grip. The violence of the night was refusing to recede. It was a tidal wave threatening to drown him in his own study. Crystal looked at his shaking hands. She looked at the blood. She swallowed the bile in her throat. She didn't stand up. She reached down, picked up the book she had dropped, and smoothed the crumpled page. Her hands were trembling so violently she could barely hold the spine. "No," Crystal said. Destin froze. "What did you say?" "I said no." Her voice shook, but she forced the words out. "You owe me $1,000. Sit down." He stared at her, utterly derailed. The adrenaline and rage warring in his system crashed violently against the sheer absurdity of her defiance. He was covered in dead men's blood, and this 120 Elb archivist was demanding he sit down for story time. "Crystal, I'm out of my mind right now," he warned, his chest heaving. "I killed 3 men tonight with my hands. Leave." "Then you definitely need to sleep," she replied, her voice gaining a fraction of strength. "Sit down, Destin." It was the first time she had ever used his first name. It echoed in the quiet room, cutting through the ringing in his ears like a gunshot. He looked at her. Really looked at her. She was terrified. She was pale, her knuckles white as she gripped the book. But she hadn't run. She was looking at the monster, and she was holding her ground. Slowly, the manic energy draining from his muscles left him hollowed out. His shoulders slumped. The monstrous aura dissolved, leaving only an exhausted, blood-soaked man. He walked heavily to his armchair. He didn't sit fully back, unwilling to stain the leather, perching instead on the edge, resting his elbows on his knees. He hung his head, staring at his red-stained hands. "You shouldn't see this," he whispered. The rage was gone. Only a bleak, crushing emptiness remained. "You shouldn't see what I am." Crystal opened the book. She didn't offer him platitudes. She didn't tell him it was okay. It wasn't okay. He was a criminal and a killer. But in this room, in this exact moment, he was just a man drowning in the dark, and she was the only one with a rope. Chapter 12. Crystal began, her voice cutting through the thick scent of blood and scotch. She forced her tone to be steady. She forced it to be an anchor. The storm broke just before dawn, washing the dust from the streets. She read. She didn't stop, even when her voice went hoarse. She watched him stare at his hands until his eyelids finally, stubbornly began to droop. She kept reading as he slumped sideways into the chair, the adrenaline crash dragging him down into the blackness. When his breathing finally evened out, Crystal closed the book. She sat in the dark with the scent of blood, guarding a killer while he slept, knowing there was no going back to the way things were before. The smell of industrial bleach hung heavy in the main corridor the next morning. Crystal stood in the doorway of the massive stainless steel kitchen, a cold cup of coffee clutched in both hands. Her eyes tracked the 2 men in gray uniforms scrubbing the marble tiles near the front entrance. They worked in complete silence. There was no yellow tape, no police sirens, just the rhythmic abrasive sound of stiff bristles erasing the evidence of the night before. "You shouldn't be up here?" Crystal jumped, spilling a few drops of dark coffee onto her thumb. Victor Moretti was leaning against the center island, a tiny porcelain espresso cup looking absurdly fragile in his massive hand. He was wearing a fresh suit, but there was a dark bruise swelling along his jawline. "I needed caffeine," Crystal said, her voice defensively quiet. Victor set the cup down. The clink of china against granite was sharp. He didn't look angry, he looked analytical. He stared at her as if she were a complicated puzzle missing half its pieces. "I saw the security footage," Victor said smoothly. "From the 3rd-floor hallway. You went into the study at midnight. The boss went in at 1:45, covered in a lot of things that weren't his. You didn't come out until 6 o'clock this morning." Crystal gripped her mug tighter. The ceramic was losing its heat. "I was doing my job." "Your job is in the basement, Ms. Martin, finding dead money." Victor pushed off the island and walked slowly toward her. His sheer mass was intimidating, designed to make people shrink. Crystal forced herself to hold her ground. Destin Russo does not let people see him bleed. He does not let people see him lose his temper. The men who see that side of him usually end up in an oil drum, but you walked out. "I read him," Crystal said flatly. She was too tired for Mafia intimidation tactics. Her bones ached from sleeping in a stiff chair. "That's it." "He slept?" "Yes." Victor digested this information. A complicated expression crossed his scarred face, part disbelief, part profound relief. He looked back towards the hallway where the cleaners were finishing up. The Petrovs made a heavy push. We pushed back harder. The boss took the front line. He was reckless. I haven't seen him like that in 5 years. I thought he was spiraling. Victor turned his dark eyes back to Crystal. Keep reading. Before Crystal could respond, the kitchen doors swung open. Destin walked in. He was freshly showered, dressed in dark denim and a crisp white button-down with the sleeves rolled up to his forearms. His hair was still slightly damp. He looked entirely restored, betraying absolutely none of the feral, blood-soaked exhaustion that had consumed him 6 hours ago. He took one look at Victor, then at Crystal standing rigidly by the door. "Is there a problem, Victor?" Destin's voice was calm, yet the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "No problem, boss. Just getting espresso." Victor gave Crystal a tight nod and walked out of the kitchen, giving Destin a wide berth. Silence descended on the room. Destin walked over to the coffee machine, grabbed a mug, and poured himself a cup. He didn't look at her. The tension was thick, vibrating with the unspoken memory of the night before. Crystal expected him to double down on his authority. She expected him to remind her of her place, to build a wall of cruelty to cover his vulnerability. Instead, he turned around and leaned against the counter. "How much do you still owe me?" Destin asked. Crystal blinked, thrown by the pivot. "What? The debt. Your father's money. What's the current balance?" Crystal calculated quickly. "With the auditing work and the nightly deductions, it's exactly $214,000. Destin took a sip of his coffee. He looked at her over the rim of the mug. "You're done in the basement. No more audits." Panic spiked hot and fast in her chest. "Did I make a mistake?" "I tracked the routing numbers to the Cyprus account. I just need more time to—" "You didn't make a mistake," Destin interrupted softly. "The money is gone. I knew that the day I brought you here. I just needed to put you somewhere." He set his mug down. "Your debt is now $50,000. Crystal stopped breathing. She stared at him, her mind completely short-circuiting. "You can't just erase $164,000. I can do whatever I want. It's my money. Why?" she demanded, her voice cracking. Destin looked at the floor for a long moment, the muscles in his jaw ticking. When he finally looked back up at her, the mask was gone. The cold syndicate boss was entirely absent. "Because you didn't run last night. Because you saw the absolute worst of what I am, and you told me to sit down." He took a slow breath. 50 nights, Crystal. Read to me for 50 more nights, and you walk out of those front doors a free woman. Debt clear, no strings. 50 days, less than 2 months, and she would have her life back. It was a miracle. It was the escape hatch she had prayed for every day since she was dragged into this estate. So, why did her chest suddenly ache? 50 nights, Crystal repeated. Her voice sounded hollow. Destin watched her closely, his dark eyes searching her face for a reaction he couldn't quite decipher. He nodded once, a sharp, definitive motion. "Go pack your things. You're moving out of the guest quarters." "Where am I going?" "The 2nd floor. The room at the end of the East Hall." It was the room directly across from his. He was pulling her out of the basement, elevating her from a prisoner to something entirely different. He was bringing her into his orbit. Crystal nodded slowly. The rules had changed, and neither of them knew how to play this new game. The 50-day countdown became a phantom third presence in the study. It ticked away in the background, a silent metronome measuring out the end of their arrangement. 40 days, 35, 30. As the number shrank, the atmosphere in the midnight sessions shifted. The heavy, oppressive fear that had defined his early days evaporated. She no longer sat stiffly on the edge of the wingback chair. She kicked her shoes off. She curled her feet beneath her. She started choosing the books herself, pulling from the library's vast, neglected collection, and she read biographies, thrillers, and sweeping historical sagas. For Destin, the study was the only room in the world where he could lower his shield. The insomnia didn't vanish entirely, but Crystal's voice was the antidote. He began to look forward to midnight with a quiet, desperate anticipation. He stopped sitting in the dark shadows. He moved his chair closer to the light, closer to her. On night 22, the exhaustion caught the wrong person. Crystal had spent the day helping the estate's archivist catalog, a massive shipment of antique maps Destin had acquired. It was dusty, meticulous work. By the time midnight rolled around, her eyes were burning and her limbs felt like lead. She sat in her chair, holding a thick volume of Arthurian legends. Destin was in his usual spot, nursing a glass of mineral water, his eyes already closed, listening. "The night rode through the Valley of Thorns," Crystal murmured, her voice dragged. She blinked hard, trying to focus on the text, but the letters were swimming on the page. The warm amber light of the reading lamp was hypnotic. The deep, heavy silence of the house pressed against her, pulling her down. The sky it was. Her chin hit her chest. Her eyes slipped shut. The heavy book slid from her relaxing grip, landing on the thick Persian rug with a muffled thump. Destin's eyes snapped open at the sound. Instinct had his hand halfway to the Sig Sauer on the table before he registered what had happened. He froze. Crystal was asleep. Her head was tilted against the wing of the chair, her breathing slow and shallow. The harsh overhead lighting she usually worked under was gone, and in the soft glow of the lamp she looked incredibly young. The permanent crease of worry between her eyebrows had smoothed out. Destin slowly lowered his hand from the gun. He didn't wake her. He sat perfectly still, listening to the rhythm of her breathing. It was a bizarre role reversal. For a month she had anchored him to sleep. Now she was the one adrift. He stood up, his movements slow and deliberate to avoid making a sound. He walked over to the leather sofa against the far wall and picked up a heavy woven cashmere throw. He crossed the room and stood over her. Up close he could see the faint smudges of ink on her fingers, the pale skin of her neck, the steady, rhythmic pulse in her throat. She was entirely defenseless. She was in the inner sanctum of a crime boss, completely at his mercy, and she was fast asleep. A fierce, protective ache seized his chest. It was an alien sensation. Destin Russo protected assets, territory, and his men. He didn't protect soft, quiet things. Soft things were liabilities. They were leverage. But, looking down at Crystal, he knew with terrifying certainty that if anyone in the city tried to use her against him, he would burn the city to the ground. He gently draped the cashmere blanket over her shoulders, tucking it carefully around her arms. Crystal sighed in her sleep, leaning into the warmth, her cheek resting against the soft fabric. Destin stepped back. He didn't return to his armchair. Instead, he walked over to the heavy oak doors. He locked the deadbolt. Then, he pulled a straight-backed wooden chair from a side table, placed it facing the door, and sat down. He crossed his arms over his chest. He didn't sleep that night. He didn't even try. He sat in the dark and kept watch. He guarded the room. He guarded her rest. For the first time in his life, the silence wasn't filled with the ghosts of his violence. It was filled with the steady, reassuring sound of someone else's peace. When the first gray light of dawn crept through the edges of the curtains, Crystal shifted. She groaned softly, her eyes fluttering open. Disorientation hit her first. She felt the heavy blanket, the stiff angle of her neck, the realization that she wasn't in her bed. She sat up abruptly, clutching the cashmere throw. Destin was sitting across the room watching her. "I fell asleep," she gasped, panic flooding her system. She looked at the clock on the mantel, 6:00 a.m. "I'm so sorry. I missed the whole night. You didn't sleep." "I'm fine," Destin said. His voice was rough, gravelly from a night of silence, but his eyes were clear. "I broke the deal," Crystal stammered, frantically trying to fold the blanket. "You were paying me to read. I failed. You can add the $1,000 back to the debt." Destin stood up. He walked over to her slowly. He reached down and gently took the folded blanket from her shaking hands, tossing it onto the armchair. He looked down at her, his expression utterly stripped of its usual armor. "The debt is gone, Crystal," he said quietly. She froze. "What? I zeroed it out yesterday." Her breath hitched. She stared at him, her brain struggling to process the words. "But we had 22 nights left. I don't care about the money." "I never cared about the money." Destin stepped closer. The space between them vanished. He wasn't looming. He was just intensely present. "I cared about the excuse it gave me to keep you in this room." Crystal looked up into his dark eyes. The world outside, the heavy oak doors, the syndicate, the blood, the danger, felt a million miles away. "You're free," Destin said. The words clearly cost him something. "You can pack your bags. Victor will drive you wherever you want to go. You never have to see this place again." Crystal stood up slowly. She was inches away from him. She could feel the heat radiating from his chest. She was free. She had survived. The nightmare was over. She looked at the door. Then she looked back at the man who had spent the entire night guarding her sleep. "What time tonight?" she whispered. Destin's eyes widened, a fractured breath escaping his chest. "Crystal's midnight?" she asked, her voice steadying. She wasn't a hostage anymore. She was making a choice. Destin reached up, his hand hovering for a second before his knuckles gently brushed against her cheek. It was a touch so light it felt like a ghost. "Midnight," he agreed. The morning after Crystal's debt was erased, the estate felt fundamentally altered. The air was no longer thin with tension. The heavy oppressive gravity of her captivity had vanished, replaced by the dizzying, terrifying weight of free will. She didn't pack her bags. She didn't ask for Victor's car. Instead, Crystal walked down to the main kitchen at 9 o'clock in the morning, poured a cup of coffee, and walked out the glass doors onto the sprawling stone patio. The sun was bright, blindingly so. For a month, her existence had been confined to the windowless basement and the dim amber glow of the third-floor study. Feeling the hot morning sun on her face was a shock to her system. "You should have left." A deep voice rumbled behind her. Crystal turned. Victor was standing in the doorway, his massive frame blocking the light. He wasn't holding his usual espresso. His hands were tucked casually into his pockets, but his eyes were sharp, scanning the perimeter of the lawn before settling on her. "Good morning to you too, Victor," Crystal said, taking a sip of her coffee. It was bitter and hot. Victor stepped onto the patio. The gravel crunched under his heavy leather shoes. "I'm not making small talk, Ms. Martin." The boss wiped the ledger. "He gave you an out, a clean break. People in our world don't get clean breaks. They get buried or they get burned. You were handed a miracle, and you're standing on the patio drinking a dark roast." "I made a choice," Crystal said softly, looking out over the manicured hedges. "It was a stupid choice." Victor's tone wasn't malicious, it was brutally practical. The Petrovs didn't just back down after the warehouse raid. They're regrouping. They have eyes in the city. They have ears on the payroll. It won't take them long to figure out that the boss pulled a girl out of the basement and put her in the bedroom across from his. You are a vulnerability, and in this life, vulnerabilities are the first things to get a bullet. Crystal gripped her mug tightly. "Does Destin know that?" "Of course he knows that," Victor scoffed. "Why do you think he told you to leave? He's trying to cut you loose before the splash zone reaches you. He wants you alive more than he wants you here." "And what do you want, Victor?" Victor paused. He looked at the girl who had somehow tamed the feral insomniac beast that ran their syndicate. He remembered the blood, the erratic violence, the frantic midnight pacing that used to define Destin Russo. Then he remembered the quiet, the focus, the cold precision that had returned over the last month. "I want my boss sharp," Victor finally answered, his voice dropping low. "When you are in this house, he sleeps. When he sleeps, he thinks. And when he thinks, we win. So, for the sake of the family, I'm glad you're here. But for your own sake, you should have run." He turned and walked back inside, leaving Crystal alone with the sun and the chilling reality of her decision. That night at midnight, she walked up to the third-floor study. The heavy oak door was already open. Destin was standing by the unlit fireplace, his hands braced on the stone mantel, his head bowed. He had discarded his suit jacket, but his shoulder holster was securely strapped across his chest. The Sig Sauer wasn't on the side table, it was tucked against his ribs. "I told Victor to have a car waiting for you at the south gate," Destin said. He didn't turn around. Crystal stepped into the room and quietly closed the door behind her. The click of the latch was deafening in the silence. "I told Victor to cancel the car." Destin whipped around. The calm demeanor he had maintained that morning was fractured. His jaw was clenched so tightly a muscle ticked furiously beneath his ear. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, stopping inches from her. The sheer physical presence of him was overwhelming. "You don't understand what you're doing." He gritted out his voice, a harsh rasp. "You think because I sat in a chair and listened to you rid the monster is gone. It's not gone, Crystal. It's waiting. The Petrovs are making a play for the Southside docks tonight. They put a bounty on my inner circle. My world is about to catch fire." "Then let it burn," Crystal said. She didn't flinch. She didn't back away. She looked up at him, her brown eyes steady and fierce. "I spent my whole life being safe. My father was safe. He was quiet and careful, and he still ended up with a bullet in his head in a filthy alleyway. Safe is an illusion." Destin reached out, his hands gripping her shoulders. His fingers dug into the soft wool of her sweater. "If they find out about you, they will use you to gut me. They will tear you apart. Then you better make sure they don't get the chance," she challenged, her voice trembling, slightly betraying her fear. But her posture never wavered. Destin stared at her. He saw the terror she was trying to hide, and he saw the absolute terrifying loyalty that was overpowering it. She was standing in the center of the blast radius, fully aware of the danger and refusing to move. A ragged breath tore through his chest. The resistance he had been building all day shattered completely. He didn't think, he just moved. His hands slid from her shoulders to frame her face, his thumbs brushing over her cheekbones, and he kissed her. It wasn't a gentle, cinematic kiss. It was desperate. It was rough and bruising, born of a month of forced distance and agonizing restraint. Crystal gasped against his mouth, her hands flying up to grip the lapels of his shirt. The sudden contact was electric. He tasted like scotch and impending violence, a dark, intoxicating mix that made her knees weak. Destin pulled her flush against his chest, his arms wrapping around her waist, anchoring her to him. He kissed her until the lingering fear in her system dissolved, replaced by a fierce, burning heat. When he finally pulled back, he was breathing heavily, resting his forehead against hers. "You're a fool," he whispered, his eyes closed. "I know," she breathed back. He stepped away, putting a tortuous foot of space between them. He looked down at his watch. 12:15 a.m. "I have to leave," Destin said, his voice hardening, slipping back into the cadence of the syndicate boss. "I have to end this tonight. If I don't sever the head of the Petrov family before sunrise, we won't have a tomorrow." Crystal nodded slowly, walked over to the wingback chair and picked up a book she had left there yesterday. "I'll be right here." Destin looked at her, sitting in the amber light, holding the book like a shield. He drew his gun, checked the chamber, and slid it back into the holster. "Lock the door behind me. Don't open it for anyone but me, Destin." He paused at the threshold, turning back to look at her. "Come back," she commanded quietly. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, transforming his harsh face into something devastatingly human. "I always come back to the sound of your voice, Crystal." The hours bled together. Crystal sat in the study, the book open on her lap. But she didn't read a single word. She listened. The estate was terrifyingly quiet. Most of the guards had mobilized. Victor had vanished. She was alone in the fortress, waiting for the echo of a war being fought in the dark alleys and rain-slicked docks of the city. Every creak of the floorboard sent a spike of adrenaline straight to her heart. She paced the length of the Persian rug. She stared out the heavily curtained window at the ink-black night. She imagined the worst. She imagined Victor walking through the door, his scarred face grim, carrying the news that the insomnia had finally won, that the beast had been put down. At 4:30 a.m., her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a burner phone Victor had handed her hours ago. She snatched it out, her fingers clumsy with panic, and pressed it to her ear. "Hello? The docks are clear." Victor's voice was exhaustingly flat, devoid of its usual booming resonance. "The Petrov brothers are gone. The syndicate is neutralized." Crystal slumped against the heavy mahogany desk, her legs suddenly refusing to hold her weight. A choked sob escaped her throat. "Destin? He's alive," Victor confirmed. "We're on our way back." The line went dead. Crystal didn't move for 20 minutes. She stayed on the floor by the desk, letting the massive crushing wave of relief wash over her. It was over. The threat was eliminated. Just past 5 o'clock in the morning, the heavy deadbolt of the study door clicked. Crystal scrambled to her feet. Destin pushed the door open. He didn't look like the feral monster who had stumbled into this room weeks ago, covered in blood. He was immaculate. His suit was dark, his tie loosened and still present. There wasn't a drop of blood on his hands or his face. He had taken the time to wash it away. He had stood in some safe house, scrubbing the violence from his skin before he allowed himself to walk back into her presence. The care in that simple, calculated action broke Crystal's heart in the best possible way. He closed the door behind him and leaned back against the heavy wood, exhaling a long, shuddering breath. The adrenaline had completely left his system, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. Crystal crossed the room. She didn't hesitate. She threw her arms around his neck, burying her face against his collarbone. Destin let out a low groan, wrapping his arms tightly around her waist, burying his face in her hair. He inhaled deeply, breathing in the scent of her vanilla soap and the dusty pages of the library. It was the scent of safety. "It's over," he murmured against her ear. "The city is ours. Nobody will ever touch you." "Are you hurt?" she asked, pulling back just enough to scan his face. The dark circles under his eyes were prominent tonight, a testament to the brutal toll the last few hours had taken. "Just tired," he whispered. Crystal took his hand. His fingers were cold. "Come sit down. I'll read." She tried to pull him toward the leather armchairs toward their sanctuary, but Destin dug his heels in. He didn't move. He looked at the wingback chair, the reading lamp, the stack of books on the side table. It was the theater where they had performed their strange, life-saving play for 30 days. "No," Destin said softly. Crystal looked back at him confused. "But you haven't slept." I don't need a story tonight, Crystal." He tightened his grip on her hand and gently pulled her toward the door. He didn't lead her back to the shadows of the study. He led her out into the hallway, past the heavy oak doors, and down the corridor to the master suite. The room was vast, dominated by a massive king-sized bed and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the eastern horizon. The sky outside was just beginning to bruise with the pale purple and gold light of dawn. Destin let go of her hand. He stripped off his suit jacket, tossing it over a chair. He pulled his holster over his head, setting the gun on the nightstand with a quiet, final thud. He kicked off his shoes and lay back on the mattress, resting his head on the pillows. He looked utterly drained, yet entirely at peace. He held out his hand to her. Crystal kicked off her own shoes. She climbed onto the edge of the enormous bed, moving cautiously at first, before crawling across the duvet to lie down beside him. Destin immediately pulled her against his side, his arm wrapping heavily around her, tucking her head under his chin. There were no books. There were no spoken words echoing in the silence to keep the ghosts at bay. Crystal lay still, listening to the steady, strong rhythm of his heartbeat beneath his shirt. For the first time, she wasn't guarding him from a distance. She was the anchor holding him down in the dark. "You don't have to talk," Destin mumbled, his voice already thick with impending sleep, his eyes fluttering shut. "Just stay right here." "I'm not going anywhere," she whispered. The morning light broke over the horizon, spilling across the floorboards, washing the shadows from the room. Crystal felt the tension drain from his rigid muscles. His breathing deepened, shifting into the slow, heavy cadence she knew so well. He was asleep. Crystal closed her own eyes, feeling the warmth of his chest beneath her cheek. The Mafia boss, who couldn't close his eyes without seeing the end of the world, had finally found his peace. And for the first time since she arrived at the estate, Crystal let herself drift off completely safe in the arms of the monster she had saved. The dark, silent nights of a ruthless Mafia boss and the captive who accidentally became his cure. What happens when the man who controls the city's criminal underworld realizes his greatest weakness is the voice of a woman he forced into his life? This is just the beginning of Destin and Crystal's story. If you want to hear part 4 and find out how this tense midnight arrangement evolves, hit that like button, share this video with a fellow romance lover, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss an episode. See you in the dark.